Love built on deception is bound to crumble. Edward's story serves as a reminder that no matter how much you sacrifice or how deeply you care, trust is fragile, and once broken, it may never be the same again. When betrayal enters a relationship, sometimes the hardest lesson is knowing when to let go and prioritize your own healing. The first thing Edward noticed was the silence. It was unnerving, the usual hum of the house, the distant chatter of kids, the muffled sound of the TV had vanished. The room felt heavy, like the calm before a storm, and the air was thick with something he couldn't quite place. Edward stared at his phone, watching as the location pin flickered again. She wasn't at work. His heart raced, pounding in his chest. The AirTag he had secretly planted under Laura's car had revealed what he had feared for months. Laura wasn't where she said she would be, and the GPS dot was now in a part of town Edward didn't recognize. His mind swirled with confusion, anger, and dread as his thoughts raced back to every small change he'd noticed. The late nights, the cold distance, her immaculate appearance before leaving the house. His throat tightened as realization began to set in. Something was very, very wrong. Edward stood frozen in the middle of the room, torn between confronting her now or letting the truth come to light on its own. But deep down, he knew tonight would change everything. Edward had always believed that love, commitment, and sacrifice would keep his marriage afloat through any storm. At 39, his life with Laura, 38, and their 3 children seemed as stable as a marriage of 9 years could be. They had their ups and downs, as any couple did, but Edward never anticipated the emotional hurricane that would tear through their lives. Over the summer, Laura's demeanor began to shift. She had been promoted at work, a move that came with immense pressure and responsibilities. Edward noticed how stressed she'd become, her graveyard shifts taking a toll on her mental health, leaving her exhausted and irritable. He tried his best to be the supportive husband. Whenever Laura came home grumpy or vented about her day, Edward listened, never taking it personally. He understood that her workload was intense, and he chalked up her outbursts to stress. But as the months passed, something about Laura's behavior didn't sit right with Edward. He noticed subtle changes, things that might have gone unnoticed to anyone else. She was paying more attention to her appearance before work. What used to be a quick grab of a ponytail and scrubs had turned into careful makeup application and fitted outfits. She was withdrawn, almost distant, no longer telling Edward about her day or sharing even the smallest details about work. Their conversations became fewer and more strained. Then there were the fights. Laura would lash out at Edward for the smallest things, her irritation spilling over into shouting matches that left Edward feeling blindsided. He couldn't understand where her anger was coming from, but he loved her. He had always loved her, so he attributed it to the stress of her job. But deep down, a seed of suspicion had been planted. By November, the emotional distance between them had grown to a chasm. Laura was working nonstop, and the time they spent together dwindled to almost nothing. The few moments they had were fraught with tension, and Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He thought back to her increasingly cold attitude, her long hours, and her sudden disinterest in their family life. And then it hit him like a cold gust of wind. There was someone else. One night, after touring a potential school for their daughter, another fight erupted. Edward had been looking forward to spending some rare time together, but Laura, without any explanation, announced that she had to work. Edward felt the frustration and resentment build up inside him. His mind raced. Was this really work, or was she slipping away to be with someone else? That night, consumed by doubt, Edward asked Laura point blank if there was someone else. She denied it, of course, vehemently. Laura called him crazy, accusing him of being paranoid and insecure. But her defensive response only fueled Edward's suspicions. In the weeks that followed, Edward's mind became a battlefield of fear and mistrust. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was being lied to. The stress was eating him alive, but he needed proof, something concrete. That's when he did something desperate. He bought an AirTag, taping it under her car in a last-ditch effort to uncover the truth. Days passed, and Laura's behavior grew more erratic. She was hanging out with friends Edward didn't approve of, disregarding his feelings entirely. They fought again, and this time Laura stormed out, claiming she was calling into work. But Edward knew better. Later that night, Edward watched as the AirTag's location pinged on his phone, not at work, but at a random apartment. He felt his heart stop. The truth was undeniable. Laura had gone to another man's place and spent the night. After 13 years of marriage, 3 children, and countless memories, she had betrayed him in the worst way possible. When Edward confronted her, Laura's response was as cold as it was shocking. "I wanted attention." She confessed that she had been talking to the other man for months, opening up to him in ways she claimed she couldn't with Edward. The emotional connection had blossomed into something physical. Edward couldn't believe what he was hearing. The woman he had built his life with, the mother of his children, had sought comfort in another man's arms. His heart shattered. How could she do this? How could she rip their family apart for someone who meant nothing? Despite the betrayal, Edward didn't give up easily. They tried therapy, long conversations, and endless tears. Edward poured his heart out, hoping to salvage whatever remained of their broken marriage. But nothing changed. Laura was still in communication with the other man, and the distance between her and Edward only widened. Months passed, and Edward found himself a shell of the man he once was. The betrayal had left scars that would never fully heal. He had given everything to this relationship, only to have it torn apart by lies and deception. The final blow came when Laura, despite everything, continued to choose the other man. It was over. Now, sitting in the silence of his empty home, Edward is haunted by the memories of what they once had. He replayed every moment in his mind, trying to pinpoint where things went wrong, how the woman he loved could do this to him. The pain was unbearable, but so was the anger. Edward wasn't just heartbroken, he was furious. The revenge came slowly. Edward wasn't a man to lash out impulsively. Instead, he began making quiet, calculated moves. He hired a lawyer, started documenting everything, and made sure that when the time came, he would be ready to fight for full custody of their children. If Laura wanted to tear their family apart, she would face the consequences. The twists and turns that had brought him to this moment were nothing short of devastating, but Edward had learned something along the way. People are unpredictable, and even those closest to you can become strangers overnight. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was accepting that the woman he loved no longer existed in the way he once knew her. As Edward prepares for the next chapter of his life, the story of betrayal, heartbreak, and revenge will forever linger in his mind. But one thing is certain: he will never let anyone take advantage of his heart again. Kelly sat at the edge of the bed, the coolness of the night air pressing against her skin through the thin curtains. The city outside buzzed with life, but inside, the silence was deafening. She glanced at the clock, 1:27 a.m. Simon wasn't home yet, and he hadn't bothered to text or call. The sinking feeling in her chest tightened. A familiar companion in the long, lonely nights she had become accustomed to. Simon, once her everything, now felt like a stranger. It wasn't always like this. When they first met, he was charming, attentive, and so full of life. Kelly remembered their whirlwind romance, the nights spent laughing until their stomachs hurt, the promises of forever whispered in the dark. But those days seemed like a distant memory, replaced by cold indifference and a growing sense of dread. It had started subtly missed dinners, vague excuses, and an unfamiliar perfume clinging to his clothes. Kelly had tried to ignore the signs, telling herself she was being paranoid, but deep down, she knew. Simon was slipping away from her, lost in a world she was no longer a part of. The first time she confronted him, he brushed it off with a laugh. "You're imagining things, Kelly. Work has just been stressful." But she knew better. The late nights, the sudden interest in his appearance, and the way his phone was always glued to his hand, the screen quickly turned away whenever she was near. He was hiding something, and it was tearing her apart. One evening, Kelly's suspicions were confirmed. Simon had told her he was going out with friends, casual night out, nothing more. But as she sat alone in their apartment, her mind wouldn't rest. Something gnawed at her, urging her to check. She hesitated, hating herself for the mistrust, but her hands moved on their own, dialing the number of one of Simon's closest friends. "Hey, is Simon with you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. A pause. No, Kelly, I haven't seen him tonight." The world seemed to tilt, her worst fears coming to life. She hung up, her heart pounding. Hours later, Simon stumbled in, the faint scent of someone else's perfume lingering on his clothes. Kelly confronted him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you weren't with your friends." Simon's reaction was explosive. "Pack your bags and go back to your parents," he shouted, his face twisted in anger. "You have no right to ask me where I am or who I'm meeting with." Kelly recoiled as if struck. The words cut deeper than any knife, leaving her gasping for air. She had always been the one to make sacrifices, to go above and beyond for him. She managed the house, worked her jobs, paid her own bills, and cared for his children from his previous marriage as if they were her own. She loved them, nurtured them, and never once asked for anything in return. But now, it felt like her entire world was crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. The days that followed were a blur of numbness and pain. Simon withdrew even further, barely acknowledging her presence unless he wanted something. And when he did speak, it was to demand or criticize. Yet, despite the heartbreak, Kelly found herself trying even harder to win him back. She cooked his favorite meals, cleaned the house until it sparkled, and gave in to his every desire in the bedroom, hoping against hope that he would see her, love her again. But Simon remained distant, his heart seemingly locked away from her. She saw the messages on his phone, the flirtatious exchanges with women whose names she didn't recognize. She knew he was meeting them, spending time with them in ways he no longer did with her. Yet, she couldn't bring herself to leave. The thought of walking away from the life they had built, the children she had grown to love, was too much to bear. One evening, as Kelly folded Simon's clothes, she found a note tucked into the pocket of his jacket. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, the neat handwriting jumping off the page. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." Kelly's world shattered. The pieces of her broken heart seemed to scatter across the floor, each one cutting deeper into her soul. She sank to the ground, the note clutched in her hand, sobs racking her body. How had it come to this? What had she done to deserve this betrayal? But as the tears flowed, something inside her began to shift. A quiet resolve took root, growing stronger with each passing moment. She couldn't keep living like this, constantly fighting for scraps of affection from a man who no longer cared. Simon had made his choice, and it was time for her to make hers. That night, as Simon slept beside her, Kelly made a decision. She would confront him one last time, but not as the broken woman he had tried to reduce her to. She would do it as the strong, capable person she had forgotten she was. The next morning, Kelly stood in the kitchen, her hands steady as she prepared Simon's coffee. He sauntered in, barely glancing at her as he checked his phone. She watched him, the man she had once loved more than anything, and felt nothing but a deep, aching sadness. "Simon, we need to talk," she said, her voice calm. He looked up, annoyance flickering in his eyes. "What now?" "I found this." She placed the note on the table, watching his reaction carefully. Simon's face paled, but he quickly recovered, a sneer curling his lips. "So what? What are you going to do about it?" Kelly took a deep breath, steadying herself. I'm done, Simon. I'm done trying to fix something you've already given up on. I've given you everything, and all you've done is take. But no more. I deserve better than this. For the first time in months, Simon looked uncertain. You're leaving? Kelly nodded, a small, sad smile on her lips. Yes, I am. I'm going back to my parents, just like you told me to. But this time, it's my choice. I won't let you keep hurting me. Simon opened his mouth to say something, but Kelly held up her hand. Don't. There's nothing left to say. She turned and walked away, her heart heavy but resolute. She packed her bags, carefully folding the life she had known into neat little piles. As she placed the last item in her suitcase, she paused, looking around the room one final time. This had been her home, her sanctuary, but now it was just a place filled with memories of pain and betrayal. With a deep breath, Kelly zipped up her suitcase and walked out the door, not looking back. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead would be difficult, but she knew she would find her way. She had to for herself, for the person she had once been, and for the person she was becoming. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the weight on her chest began to lift. For the first time in a long time, Kelly felt a glimmer of hope. She was free, and she would heal. One day, she would look back on this chapter of her life and see it for what it was: a lesson in strength, in knowing her worth, and in never settling for less than she deserved. And with that, Kelly walked forward into her new life, leaving the shattered reflections of her past behind. Today's story teaches that it is possible to heal, find love again, and emerge stronger. Even in deep pain, we have the power to rebuild and find a brighter future. True love and happiness come to those who trust, stay strong, and never lose hope. Daniel met Ava in middle school. Daniel discovered through friends that Ava had a secret crush on him, and soon he found himself falling for her too. They started dating, and their relationship blossomed over the next 4 years. From the start, their relationship was filled with passion and intensity. They shared everything: dreams, fears, and the naive belief that their love could conquer all. But Daniel's friends often ridiculed him for dating Ava. They constantly told him that she was unfaithful, but Daniel, blinded by love and innocence, refused to believe them. He trusted Ava implicitly, convinced that their bond was unbreakable. Their first major test came during their senior year of high school. The stress of exams, college applications, and the typical teenage drama took its toll, and they decided to take a break. Those 6 months apart were the longest of Daniel's life. He missed Ava terribly, but the time apart made him realize just how much he loved her. When they got back together, they promised each other that nothing would come between them again. They resumed dating, and their love seemed stronger than ever. They spent another 4 years together, 2 years after Ava had graduated. Daniel was deeply in love and saw Ava as his future wife and the mother of his children. He dreamed of a life filled with love and happiness. He believed that their love story was one for the ages, one that would withstand the test of time. 7 months before their eventual breakup, Ava introduced Daniel to her new friend, Peter. Peter was charming, funny, and supposedly gay. Ava assured Daniel that Peter was just a friend, and Daniel, wanting to trust Ava and avoid appearing jealous, accepted Peter into their social circle. Peter became a regular fixture in their lives, and Daniel thought nothing of it. 2 months before the end of their relationship, Ava announced she was going on a weekend trip to Texas with her cousins. She told Daniel she needed some time away, a break from everything. To Daniel, it was just another weekend, and he trusted her completely. He believed that everyone needed a little space now and then. That Saturday night, Daniel hadn't heard from Ava all day. Concerned, he called her, but she didn't answer. He texted her, asking if everything was okay. The reply he received was cold and distant. "Can you please leave me alone and give me some break?" Daniel was stunned. He tried calling her multiple times, desperate for an explanation, but Ava laughed it off, acting as if he was overreacting. Confused and heartbroken, Daniel drove to her house, determined to understand what was happening. When he arrived, Ava broke up with him. She said she needed time, and assured him they would get back together eventually. Daniel was devastated but clung to the hope that they would reconcile. In the following weeks, Daniel was a shadow of his former self. He struggled to understand how the girl he loved so deeply could be so distant. One day, while shopping at the market, he spotted Ava's car parked next to Peter's Jeep. Anger and betrayal surged through him. He called Ava, demanding an explanation. She brushed him off, reminding him that they were no longer together. Daniel's heart shattered. The girl he had loved for so long, the one he had planned a future with, had betrayed him. For months, Daniel was consumed by grief. He cried himself to sleep, feeling as if his heart had been ripped from his chest. Life became a dull, gray blur. The realization that Ava had been cheating on him with Peter, who was never actually gay, was a crushing blow. Ava and Peter had been involved while Daniel was blissfully unaware, believing in their love. A year passed, and Daniel slowly began to rebuild his life. Ava, now in a relationship with Peter, was expecting a baby at the age of 21. But karma has a way of balancing the scales. Peter cheated on Ava, leaving her as a single mother with no job, no friends, and no significant other. Desperate and alone, Ava reached out to Daniel's family, hoping to reconcile. But Daniel had moved on. He was now in a loving relationship with a new girlfriend, someone who cherished and respected him. Their relationship was everything Daniel had ever wanted, and he loved her more than he ever thought possible. He realized that sometimes the universe has a way of setting things right. Karma, it seemed, was indeed real. As for Ava, her life took a different turn. The once vibrant and carefree girl was now a single mother, struggling to make ends meet, while Daniel embraced a future filled with hope and love. Daniel also remembered the moments of clarity, the support of his friends and family, and he was ready to embrace the future with an open heart and a renewed sense of hope.
Eric had never imagined that silence could be so loud. It was 2:15 a.m. when he opened the front door of his home. After a grueling 18-hour shift in the trauma unit, all he wanted was to surprise Samantha. He held a bouquet of lilies, her favorite, and a box of decadent tiramisu, the dessert they had shared on the day they first met 4 years ago. The house was unusually still. As Eric stepped inside, he noticed something strange. Samantha hadn't left a light on for him like she usually did when he came home late. The soft glow that would usually greet him at the door was missing, and the air felt thick, like a secret hanging in the room, waiting to be uncovered. He tiptoed upstairs, the quiet growing more unsettling with each step. His heart, once filled with excitement, now raced with an unshakable sense of dread. Why was the house so quiet? Why was the bedroom door slightly ajar? Eric pushed the door open slowly, his breath catching in his throat. At first, his eyes couldn't make sense of the scene before him. Samantha, tangled in the sheets with someone else. A man he recognized immediately. It was her friend's boyfriend. For a moment, Eric's mind went blank, and the world stopped spinning. The bouquet slipped from his hand, the flowers falling silently to the floor. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out the rational part of his brain. His legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the spot. Samantha stirred, half awake, but the man beside her remained oblivious. She opened her eyes, and when she saw Eric standing there exhausted, confused, and utterly heartbroken, a flicker of shock crossed her face. But she didn't say a word. Eric didn't speak either. His mouth was dry, his thoughts a jumbled mess. What could he even say? Every word felt meaningless in the face of what he had just witnessed. His mind screamed at him to confront her, to demand answers, but his body refused to cooperate. Instead, he turned around and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but inside, Eric's world had just imploded. The parking lot was deserted when Eric returned to the hospital. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. It was 4 a.m., and the trauma surgeon, who could keep his cool under the most intense situations, was now breaking down, tears streaming down his face. He cried like a child, uncontrollable sobs racking his body. It was the kind of crying that comes from the deepest part of your soul, the kind that makes you feel like you might never stop. He didn't have his phone with him, didn't even think to grab it when he stormed out of the house. He was alone in the dark, consumed by betrayal, disbelief, and a heartache so deep it felt like it might swallow him whole. The hospital, a place where he had saved countless lives, now felt like a prison. A place where he couldn't escape his thoughts. Eric sat there, motionless, staring out into the night. His life, once built on trust and love, had been obliterated in an instant. His colleagues, concerned after seeing him in such a state, eventually found him in the parking lot. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. The look in his eyes said it all. They called his father, and it wasn't long before his dad arrived to pick him up, a look of sorrow on his face. The next few days were a blur. Eric took a leave of absence from the hospital, something he never imagined he would do. He had been mentally and emotionally shattered. For someone who had always been in control of his life, this was something he didn't know how to handle. He started therapy, urged by his father and friends. At first, he didn't want to go. How could talking to a stranger possibly heal the deep wounds that had been carved into his heart? But as the sessions went on, Eric began to slowly unravel the tangled mess of emotions within him. "I just don't understand how someone I loved so much could do this to me," he said during one of the sessions, his voice shaking. "I gave her everything, and this is how she repays me, with betrayal, with lies." His therapist sat across from him, calm and composed. "You're going through one of the hardest experiences a person can face, Eric. The pain you're feeling is valid, but you need to let yourself process it, not bury it." But how could he process it? Every time he thought about Samantha, about what she had done, a wave of anger and sadness would crash over him. He wanted revenge, wanted her to feel the same agony she had inflicted on him. But revenge, he knew deep down, wouldn't heal him. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Eric began to piece his life back together. The scars were still there, raw and painful, but he was learning to live with them. Therapy helped, as did the support of his family, but the anger, the need for revenge, still simmered beneath the surface. Samantha had tried to contact him. She had sent messages, tried calling, even showed up at his father's house once. But Eric refused to see her. What could she possibly say to make things right? What excuse could she offer that would undo the pain? One evening, after weeks of silence, Samantha sent a letter. It was filled with apologies and explanations. She claimed she had been lonely, felt neglected with Eric always working, always at the hospital. She said she had made a mistake, one that she regretted deeply. Eric read the letter, his hands trembling with anger. Lonely, he had been working tirelessly to provide for their future, to build a life for them. And this was how she repaid him. For a moment, he considered burning the letter, letting the flames consume her hollow apologies. But then he paused. Revenge wouldn't heal him. What he needed was closure. And that wouldn't come from anger, it would come from letting go. The lesson was clear. Even the strongest people can be broken by betrayal, but it's how you rise from the ashes that defines you.
Eric learned that healing wasn't about getting even or holding on to the pain. It was about moving forward. Even when it felt impossible, he would never be the same, but he would be stronger for it. In the end, Samantha's betrayal had shattered him, but it hadn't destroyed him. Eric was still standing, still moving forward, and that was the greatest revenge of all.
The house was dark, too quiet. As I walked through the front door, the weight of the day still clinging to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the usual silence that comes from a sleeping family. No, this was different, heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was hiding a secret. My name is Frank, and I am 41 years old. Carolyn is 39. Carolyn should have been in bed by now, but something felt off. The shadows seemed longer, the stillness louder. I called out her name, my voice low and tentative, but there was no answer. My heart picked up its pace as I walked down the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The door to our bedroom was open just a crack, light spilling out into the hallway in a sliver. I pushed it open, and that's when I saw it. Her phone glowing in her hands, the messages on the screen scrolling rapidly. The name at the top was Justin, a man I didn't recognize. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second, the world seemed to freeze. The moment I had been dreading, my heart pounded as I stepped closer, the suspense growing with each inch I covered. Carolyn looked up, startled, her face going pale. She quickly locked the phone and set it aside, but the damage was done. My mind was already spinning, searching for answers to questions I wasn't sure I was ready to ask. "What's going on?" I managed to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her lips parted, and the words came tumbling out. "I need a divorce." That was 6 months ago. 6 months since my world began unraveling. Back then, I thought it was just some meaningless online flirtation, a scammer, maybe, trying to take advantage of her. But as the weeks passed, I learned the truth. The man she had been talking to wasn't just a stranger on the internet. He was real, and worse, she had planned to meet him. At first, she claimed she didn't go through with it, and like a fool, I believed her. I believed her until the day she told me she wanted a divorce, not because of her betrayal, but because I had caused her so much emotional turmoil that she needed to heal. How did I become the villain? For weeks, I tortured myself trying to understand how our 10 years of marriage had led to this. I blamed myself for everything. Maybe I hadn't been good enough. Maybe I had driven her into the arms of another man. And when she miscarried the twins, I felt like the universe was punishing me for something I hadn't even fully understood. She told her family how much of a monster I was, and they believed her. Friends, people who used to greet me with smiles, now looked at me with judgment. I had become the bad guy in a story I hadn't even known I was a part of. And still, I tried to win her back. It wasn't until she confessed the full extent of her betrayal that reality hit. She had cheated on me with him. It was only oral, she said, as if that made it better. As if the details would somehow lessen the knife she had just driven through my chest. I didn't know what to feel. Anger, sadness, betrayal. It all blurred together, swirling in my mind like a storm I couldn't escape. And yet, I still wanted to fix things. I agreed to therapy. I told the kids it was my fault, that maybe if I had been a better husband, things wouldn't have turned out this way. We went on dates, tried to repair what was left, but I didn't trust her. How could I? Every time I looked at her, all I saw was the betrayal. And yet, I couldn't walk away. Something inside me was holding on, though I didn't know why. The paranoia was eating me alive. We went on vacation, just the two of us, in a desperate attempt to salvage our relationship. But I had made up my mind before we even left. I was going to end it all. The pain was too much. I couldn't live with the betrayal, the lies, the weight of everything I had lost. But then something strange happened. She made me laugh again. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive. I didn't follow through with my plan. I didn't end it. And when we returned home, I thought maybe, just maybe, there was hope. But the distrust was still there, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. Every time she picked up her phone, every time she left the room, the doubts crept back in. Was she still talking to him? Was there someone else? The questions gnawed at me day and night. I was trapped between the man I used to be and the man I was becoming, trapped between wanting to leave and being too scared to. I told her that the part of me that wanted to save our marriage was gone. I couldn't do it anymore. No more poly relationships, no more pretending. She gave me access to her phone and laptop, let me check everything. But no matter how many times I looked, the trust was gone. The part of me that loved her was broken beyond repair. The weeks blurred together, each day a battle between staying and leaving. My mind was a battlefield. Therapy helped, but only so much. I stopped drinking, knowing it would send me down a dangerous path. But the thoughts, the doubts, they never left. I wasn't sure what to do anymore. I wanted to leave, but I also wanted to stay. I told myself I could fix it, that I could be better. But the truth was, I wasn't the one who needed to change. She was. And yet, here I was, still trying to fix something that had been shattered long before I had even realized it was broken. In the end, I realized the hardest battle wasn't with her, it was with myself. I had to learn to let go of the person I thought I was. The man who believed that love could fix anything. The man who believed that loyalty would be enough. Because sometimes the person you trust the most is the one who will hurt you the worst. And sometimes the hardest decision isn't whether to stay or leave. It's figuring out who you are after everything falls apart. The lesson was clear. Even the strongest people can break, but healing is possible if you stop trying to save what's already lost.